We're also going to talk to some of those people in the system who've got interesting critiques and solutions. Kate Rayworth, famously of Doughnut Economics, Paul Allen, Zero Carbon Britain, Andrew Sims from the Rapid Transition Alliance, Julia Steinberger from Leeds University, and hopefully Yanis Vakifaris will also be joining us. So today we're going to look at some of the basics of money and finance and their links to the climate and ecological emergency. At 5:15, we've got the financial heading for extinction talk by Vince Knowles, followed by Boardroom Rebellion with Robert Wheeldon at 7:15. So until then, join me, Sarah Lunnan, a member of XR's political circle, former Green Party County Councillor for Gloucestershire and parliamentary candidate, Days from XR Youth, and also Jordan Rain, XR scientist. So we're going to consider why there is no going back from where we find ourselves today, what we can learn about our financial system and our response to the emergency of the natural world. If you've got any questions, put them in the chat or send them via Facebook and Twitter using the hashtag #NoGoingBack. So where are we? Well, like many organisations across the globe, XR finds itself on the financial brink. 12 months to the day from which we burst onto the national consciousness, world consciousness, the impact of the global crisis has not spared the Canaries. Right now, how we manage our failing economic system will be fundamental to reclaiming our future. And we must remember that the old normal was going to kill us. As we wait for the COVID peak to pass, the weight of that other peak that needs to be flattened sits on our shoulders, the carbon peak. And let's admit it, those with access to power already have their request on the desks of our government. They are already meeting to discuss propping up the very system that has brought us to this crisis. The system that has failed for 30 years to stop the unfolding destruction of our natural world, in which we lose all that we cherish and ultimately all that we love. The system that has been found so failing to deal with the pandemic affecting us right now. So Days, I'd like to come over to you and ask you, as a member of XR Youth, does it make sense to you to link finance and the environment? And what do you make of the argument that we need to have the money, the resources available first to tackle environmental issues? Hello, Days.
Hey, welcome. Yeah, I think we have to. I feel like sometimes, especially in public discourse, we always talk about the environment as this thing that almost lives by itself without touching any other parts of life. And that's just simply not true. So I think talking about finance and the economy and the environment is such an important place to be, especially when we actually look at it. It does look like the financial sector is behind a lot of the problems that we do see now. And it is the people with big money and big corporations who are causing the main parts of climate impact. So there is no other way that we can start looking at these systematic issues without looking at the finance situation.
So they're very much interlinked. You see the finance and the environment as being interlinked with each other.
Yeah, exactly. Very much so. I think it will be really hard to look at it without seeing the overlap and the parallels between how we invest our money and also how that affects our environment. For example, the banks that we use, just even as people, as individuals, how do we know that our money isn't being used to finance fossil fuels? How do we know that our pensions aren't being used to fuel the destruction of our Earth? So I think we need to start looking at the financial aspects of the climate crisis.
And Jordan, I'd like to ask you, because I know you do lots of communicating around the science, but when you're talking to people about climate and the damage to our natural world, do you often make the connection between that and the financial system?
Well, I think it's not really done enough. I find it's really confusing, all of this the economic terminology and climate change itself is incredibly confusing. But it helps me a lot to go back to this fundamental question when we're talking about the economy, questioning what it's actually for. And economists are actually agreed on this. They say that it is to sustain us, to sustain our well-being, our happiness. And that's not a controversial topic. But the thing that's missing here in the economic context from a mainstream point of view is this real proper understanding and sitting with what actually sustains the economy. So we know what the economy sustains, but what sustains the economy? And actually at a fundamental level, economists are agreed on this as well. It's labor, yes, but it's also natural resources. You can't produce any of the stuff that we grind up into the products that we use without having natural resources. And so at a very, very fundamental level, the economy and the natural world are interlinked.
And we need to make more of those fundamental links when we talk about climate, and understanding the economic system is almost becomes as important as understanding the systems of our natural world. To demand change on one, to affect change to our natural world, we're going to have to demand change to our economic system. This is what I'm hearing you saying is your understanding.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it comes down, I think, more on the side of economists. I think scientists do talk about the financial impacts of not taking action. I think what I'm really excited about this week to do is to really open the lid on how our economic system works, and actually some of the whether knowing or unknowing ignorance that's out there. And at the end of the day, it comes down to this fundamental concept that the economy, if you think of it as a square, it doesn't exist in isolation, and the square can just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger with no consequences. This square exists within a wider circle, which is our ecosystem. And if our economy is small compared to the size of the circle, then it's fine for us to keep growing and use a little bit more, because we can the resources that we can consume can be replenished at the same or a greater rate. But as this economy gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, we start to consume resources at a faster rate than which they can be replenished. And once it gets really, really, really big, then we pierce the circle, and the systems that support both a healthy climate and also a healthy economy start to collapse. And this is something that we really need to communicate to as many people as possible. And
I think there is something about seeing the economy as a system as opposed to a given, because for very many people, the economic system is just seen as common sense. So the idea that you have to go out to work and exchange your labour for a wage to have a place to live, to be able to afford food, is actually part of a system that's been constructed. Doesn't have to be that way, but like the sun rising in the east, it's seen as a given. You know, the fact that you have to pay your debts to the detriment of your family health, your mental health and well-being is now seen as a given. The fact that land is privately owned within nations is seen as a given. The fact that the economy has to carry on expanding, otherwise we have a recession with all of the negative impacts to people's health, to the investment that we need, all of these things are seen as a given, and yet they're part of a system which we've accepted and certainly for the last 30 years, there's been no real critique to it. So I think it's interesting to actually try and shift the way that we look at the economic system and seeing it as something which has been designed and implemented, as opposed to it's the sun rising in the east. And in doing that kind of critique, I think maybe it also allows us to then assess whether the system we're using is delivering what's needed. And because, you know, it's delivered many things for us, hasn't it? You know, we've got smartphones and iPhones. I can sit here and talk to all of these people, all who are all over the world. But I guess we ultimately are going to have to say, is this system we've got, do the benefits outweigh the negatives? And is it able to provide us with what we need at this moment in time? And right now, 50 years of inaction on climate change, it seems to me that it's failed to deliver what is actually needed. I don't know, Days, what do you think? Do you think that have the benefits outweighed the negatives?
Not particularly. I think that even as you were saying, like the economic model that we have now doesn't really work for anyone. And I think it's that moment of like I can see in the chat that Helen talks about it not being a science and all the rules are made up. And it kind of does feel like that, how we've kind of just gone into this like mundane of whenever we think about the economy, we're just there like, that's just the way it happens and we shouldn't ask anything more of it. And I think this is kind of where we can shake it up and get people to understand that this is something that has almost been built as a construct and we can remodel this economy. Like, for example, you're talking about like the circular models, and that there are other models rather than the one that we're living in. We've just come out of a recession, it feels like, and it feels like we're going back into one. So clearly it's not working. So yeah, I would also like to even look at maybe even discussing parts of like what the future could look like and what other models can we adopt or even think about.
So I wonder, Daisy, if you've come across Kate Raworth, who I spoke about in the introduction, and her idea of Doughnut economics, right, which is really quite beautiful. So she takes the idea of the donut, and the outer circle are our planetary boundaries. So we cannot, if we start moving outside of the planetary boundaries, then we are exhausting our resources and we are no longer sustainable. And the hole in the middle is, if you're in the hole in the middle, then you are in need. So you are not, as a human being, you do not have enough. You don't have a place to live. You don't have access to enough to eat or heating. And so the aim is that everybody is within the ring of the donut. So so that our needs are met within that ring. And as an economic model, it would actually require us to take note of the things that are called externalities. So at the moment, environmental pollution, almost like carbon emissions, although their carbon trading has been brought in, are those externalities. And so we've developed a system where the very things we need to survive are considered external to that system, not valued by that system. And so I think those different models are really interesting to start looking at and working within. And of course, the people who are least interested in them, I see in the chat, it seems Amsterdam seems to be agreeing with Kate Raworth, and that's really exciting. And maybe we should have a little think then about how COVID and the coronavirus has actually changed the landscape we're in at the moment. So Jordan, maybe I could come to you on that in terms of economics and environment initiatives like Amsterdam, looking at using Kate Raworth's donut theory. What do you see any, and it seems a strange thing to ask in light of the grief that we're experiencing at the moment, the huge changes and the restrictions on our lives, but is there anything we can learn from our response to COVID-19?
Yeah, definitely. I think fundamentally what this pandemic is about resilience. It shows us just how vulnerable and fragile our economy is, and if anything, it gives us this really visceral lived experience of what it's like for us to pierce the circle. Except in this case, it's a pandemic that has revealed our vulnerability and not certain aspect of the climate and ecological emergency. So in this situation that we've got now, you've got businesses that are running with being able to have, having maybe 10 days of cash reserves before they start to default on their loans. And in a global economic system that was designed for a stable world. And this is the key, is that when you have a stable climate, just-in-time delivery where everything arrives just in time, the food arrives just in time, the products arrive just in time to the shop, that works. But when you have a severe shock, whether it's a pandemic or the climate and ecological emergency, whether it's drought or a severe storm, suddenly that doesn't work. And when you have a system that has no resilience in it, then it starts to crumble very quickly. So
there's obviously there's been so much written about COVID and its impact on the global economy. Even though it's so recent, you know, but the impacts have been so massive. But a group of investment risk analysts, McKinsey, have written quite a lot about COVID, and they've done some really interesting stuff about the links between what's happening to the economy with COVID and why it's similar to what's going to unfold with the climate crisis. And their analysis has been really, really interesting. So they see both of these shocks as being a physical shock to the economy, as opposed to a loss of confidence. So if we lose confidence in the economy, governments can restore confidence, national banks can restore confidence, they can buy stocks, they can buy debt, they can restore confidence into the economy. But this external physical shock is very, very hard to restore what's lost from the economy. And the impacts of these grow non-linear. They're not linear. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out. Nobody can tell, because of those incredibly long supply chains that we also rely on in our foods, in manufacture, in transport. We just don't know how all of that interlinks. And they very much see the pandemic as a real foretaste of what is going to happen with regard to climate. And they also recognise that the impact of climate is going to be so much bigger. But I'd say what they failed to recognise is the fact that the impact of the climate will not ever stop. You know, that it's just going to carry on getting worse and worse, because we will flatten the COVID curve and life will return to something where we learn to live with it. But the climate is just going to carry on unless we take that action now. So, Dave, I was wondering what links you see between the response to COVID-19, national, global, and the response needed to address the climate and nature emergencies. And I was wondering, in particular, in, you know, the fact that so many like mortgage holders have been told they don't have to repay their mortgages for 3 months. People that have been given some respite for evictions for lack of rent, that all of a sudden the requirement for us to repay our debts, rather than it being an absolute, it seems like there's some leeway there. And I wonder what you feel about that around debt, COVID, and yeah, how that impacts globally.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way that they've kind of done what we've asked them to do for such a long time, but it had to take a pandemic to hit us and feel really unprepared for them to do so. I've been looking into some of the debts and how that has affected the climate crisis. Like, for example, countries in the global south owing massive debts to the IMF, and how they basically hold on really, really tight restrictions for those loans. So they would continue having to basically buy into the fossil fuel industry and keep mining and keep using the natural resources in their countries to kind of try and pay back that debt. I would actually like to pose a question to you, Sarah, and what do you think can be done about that? How do we get these countries out of having to pay these debts, or, you know, continuing this climate disaster?
You know, it is a really good question. You know, the hold that debt ends up having over us as individuals, as countries, the last 10 years of austerity, which you could argue quite well has impacted on our ability to respond to the COVID crisis, and also internationally in the global south, with some of those very, very indebted countries who under the terms of the IMF loans that they've received are actually forced to invest in fossil fuels, forced to cut back on their healthcare, you know, forced to cut back, privatise their water systems, for example, all of which will not only impact on the country's ability to address the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, but also means they cannot actually address the pandemic. which is currently happening. And we've known for a very long time that globally, a viral pandemic is one of the biggest risks that we face in terms of breakdown of societies. But it's almost like we've just crossed our fingers, like we're doing climate change. We've crossed our fingers because it wasn't happening, and it hasn't happened. So yes, international debt strike, you know, or international citizens assembly to actually say, is it fair? You know, what's happening to these countries? And so that those of us in the north and in developed nations can actually understand the impacts of what's happening to those countries. It's, yeah, maybe that's what we need. International Global Assembly. Jordan, the impact of the coronavirus lockdown, it's been pretty big. It's been quite immense, changed my lifestyle massively, and my family's lifestyle. The noise has disappeared from my street and from my town. I can hear birds song and owls at night. But what have been the implications on our emissions? Has it been noticeable?
Yeah, I mean, air pollution has dropped significantly. I think as much as 50% in some places, and emissions are down, clearly down. You know, I would hazard that you know, anyone who says that's a good thing, I think you know, we want this to be happening in a controlled and ordered way, rather than uncontrolled, chaotic way in which it has, and that has resulted in so much devastation. But I think there's also quite an interesting thing that's been revealed in the shutdown. You know, none of us are flying. People aren't really leaving our houses, and yet the global emissions drop is projected to be in the region of around about 7 to 8%. So what this shows us is that the challenge ahead of us goes way deeper than just flying less and recycling more. Obviously that's really important, but actually what coronavirus is showing us is just how dependent our systems are on carbon. So what we need to do as a springboard from this is change the system so that it values the circle that I talked about just before. And if we can do that, then it completely changes the economics of oil. And there'll be plenty of people out there who will be saying that we don't have the money for it. But you know, one of the other sort of interesting things about what coronavirus has shown us is that, you know, this narrative that we were told of austerity being necessary, of it being the only option, no longer stands up to scrutiny. You know, we were told that this was the only way, but we've seen now that if the need is there, the money is there. And, you know, say, for example, with the Green New Deal, I think it was around about £330 billion that was estimated as the cost of the Green New Deal before coronavirus, which is around about the same as what Rishi Sunak, our Chancellor, offered banks last week. So the money is there to fund the solutions that we need to move past both the coronavirus crisis and the climate and ecological emergency.
And interestingly, I think the Green New Deal was over 10 years. They were looking at spending £350 billion, and Rishi Sunak has basically found that money in the space of not quite 10 days, but not far off 10 days. You know, it is in many ways what the Conservative government has done has like upended almost 20, maybe even 30 years of neoliberal ideology. They've nationalised the wage bill, they've nationalised the railways. It's just remarkable. It is ultimately remarkable. They haven't found a magic money tree so much as a magic money forest. And there's also going to have to be a reckoning as well as to the wealth and the resources which have been mobilised to deal with COVID-19 are the wealth and the resources of this country that we have. But because they've been talked about in money terms, and all money is created from debt, there's this idea that we have to pay the money debt, we have to pay the money back. And how that will happen and what impact that will have on people like you, Days, as you move into the future, and do you walk into the next 30 or 40 years of austerity? What does that actually mean, and who are we paying the money back to anyway? Because it's our wealth that we almost inherit as citizens of the earth. So why do we have to pay it back? You know, because we're mobilizing our resources. I think there's different ways of looking at these questions, but I don't. What does it feel like, you know, being on the cusp of your 20s and looking forward to that kind of future of somebody saying, you've got to pay back all of this debt we needed to spend to deal with a pandemic that we knew was coming?
That's not fun. Obviously, yeah. I think it is one of those things that, especially as young people, whenever we talk about money and the debt that's coming our way, whether it's through like uni or school or anything, it is quite scary. And in a way, we kind of just block it out of our minds and just hope for better. But I think this is kind of where young people can kind of harness this chaos and kind of think, how can we best like understand the way the economy works and ask for better measures? That's really what we have to do, and we have to fight for a fairer and just economy, or we're just going to grow up with crippling debt. Like, I'm already halfway through uni and I've hardly had a year of teaching this year because of strikes and corona, but I still have to pay my $9,000 this year. So debt is kind of one of those things that happens, but in a way I feel like even now talking about it, I feel like I'm a bit like docile to all of it. I'm like, oh, that's just the way it is. But, you know, maybe I need to shake a few feathers and say that's not the way it is, and start thinking of ways that we can create less debt, or if anything, have debt jubilees. Get rid of all the debt.
So there's one of the questions that just came up on the chat was, don't banks just print the money? So I was wondering, like, what's your understanding of what money is? I don't know, Jordan, what do you understand money to be?
Well, I mean, this question of banks printing money is a really interesting one, because yes, they can print money, but the trouble when you print money is that means that there's more money supply. So each individual note is then worth less. So what that means is if the Bank of England is going to go around printing loads and loads of money to essentially help the economy afloat, then the people that are going to be penalised are savers. Anyone who has £5,000 in their bank, that money is going to be worth less in a year than it was today. And the thing that I find kind of interesting about all of this is that, you know, as has been mentioned, our economy, the money that circulates in our system is largely debt. I think is it 97%, Sarah?
Yeah.
And essentially, the government, the economy functions on spending. It wants the money to continually be circulating in the economy, because someone's spending is another person's salary, which then allows them to produce a service that someone else spends. What I find really interesting is that if you look at the research, in crises, people actually want to save money. But because this economy is debt-based, meaning that, say, for example, if you borrow £100, you need to pay back £110, which then means that the economy needs to grow in order for you to be able to pay it. Saving goes against everything the system wants you to do. So the system penalises savers, and it's also at odds with who we are as people. So at the end of the day, what we have is a situation. I love this quote by Tim Jackson. It goes like, you know, this economy is essentially a story about us being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to create impressions that won't last on people that we don't care about. And essentially what that speaks to is, in order to be happy, we don't need very much. But the system encourages us to take as much as we can and spend as much as we can.
I think there's also, because our money system is based on debt, and Positive Money are brilliant on this. If anyone wants to go and understand how our money is created and the impact it has on us as people and on our natural world, go and check out the Positive Money site. Brilliant. Really, they're really, really good on this. But because 97% of our money is created from debt, we have to pay it back with interest. it's become almost a moral issue to meet your debts. You have to pay your debts off. You have to make more money to pay back your debts with the interest. And if you take that on an economy-wide issue, that means you have to grow the economy. The economy next year has to be bigger with more money in it so that you can pay your debts back. That means more people next year have to take out debt so that you can pay back what you owe to the banks with interest. And then the next year after, even more people have to take out more debts, paying back more interest. And so the economy, just for us to pay our debts back, has to keep on growing. Debts, and the debt can be our debt, household debt, it can be government debt, so it's all owned by the government. But if we don't have debt, then we don't have money. And if we don't have money, we don't have supply in the economy and demand. And if we don't have that, we have a recession. And that means that we end up in periods of austerity, even though in this latest period of austerity, household debt has continued to grow. So we're stuck in a system of debt, austerity, recession, and economic and economic uncertainty and destruction of our natural world. We're enslaved, to do things which actually don't bring us happiness or well-being, in my opinion. So I agree.
To bring that full circle back to the relationship that this growth-based economy, this sort of intractable attachment to debt, this growth might seem small on a year-by-year basis. We've been averaging somewhere in the range of 3 and 4% over the last few decades. But what that actually means, if you take 3% growth over a number of years, is that our economy doubles in size every 20 years. And sure, you're going to have some productivity improvements, you're going to be more efficient, but what that means is if the economy is doubling in size, then you're using a hell of a lot more resources every 20 years. And so that kind of puts into context just how quickly the box can go from being quite small relative to the size of the circle to one that actually really starts to pierce through the sides.
So yes, I agree with you. And it seems to me that is a fundamental for everything else. You can talk about economics, credit, defaults, swaps, interest rate, Bank of England loans, money supply, all of those other issues, everything that's incredibly difficult to understand. Fundamental issue of an ever expanding economy on a finite planet seems to me that's the wall that you keep butting up against and that economics can't answer. And one of the questions on that's come in from Henry Holtzmere is, what about degrowth, and how would we have a paradigm for degrowth within the system that we have? And I don't know. I mean, I think those are the questions that we actually need our economists to be answering now, not how we keep this show on the road, but how we have a system of degrowth in some areas of the economy and growth in those areas like the global south where they need it. And another question is actually for you, Days, is can you speak for how it is as a young person? You did touch on it a little bit, like currently having your education suspended, like currently having the university closed down. So what's the impact been?
Yeah, I think it's been financially not great. Yeah, because obviously, as I spoke to before, I'm still having to pay the full year anyway, which is just adding like another £9,000 onto the debt I'm already owing. Also, with the lack of jobs, there isn't that many jobs for young people at the moment, but everyone's being made redundant left, right and centre. We're all signed into things like tenancy agreements near our universities. Some people have been asked to go home, but they still have to continue paying their rent. So it's quite an interesting time. But yeah, there's really not much to say apart from like it's just not very fun. But yeah, it is a bit worrying because this kind of makes us think, how are we going to complete our year, whether we will end up getting the grades that we feel like we deserve. and also how that will affect our future incomes as well. It's just something to think about, but not think too hard on, or probably get to a very dark place.
And there's another question here, then maybe Jordan, you might like to talk to this, is do we think the current response we've seen to the coronavirus, will it see an increase in public appreciation for scientific expertise? So, you know, we've heard day after day we're being led by the science coming from senior politicians. Do you think there's likely to be any impact on them saying that and their willingness to be led by the climate science?
I hope so. Your guess is as good as mine, but I think what we're seeing today is that, to paraphrase Michael Gove, Britain is not tired of experts. We're seeing, for example, in states with strong Muslim presence, that mosques are telling people to stay home and listen to the science. We're seeing a huge increase in traffic and visibility of epidemiologists, infectious disease experts, and scientists in general. So that is something that fills me with hope, and hopefully that this will carry on into the future. I mean, the big unknown here is that the big difference between the pandemic and the climate and ecological emergency is that the pandemic is very fast moving and it's visible, and the climate and ecological emergency is something that is invisible, at least so far to the West. I mean, I must emphasize that people, hundreds of thousands of people, are already dying every year in the global South due to the climate and ecological emergency. But right now, to people in high income countries, it's not something that they're seeing a huge amount yet. Of course, there is flooding that is inundating the country and things like that, but it's not impacting our lives in the same profound way that the pandemic is. But who was it that said the pandemic is a portal? Was it Arundhati Roy or Yuval Harari? I think this is the central point, is that what this has allowed us to do is see what it may be like in the future when the impacts of climate breakdown hit harder.
So we've got we're coming to the end, and there's loads of questions here. I can talk about, like, one question's just come in from Annika Sutcliffe about how we actually value the environment as well, but with an intrinsic value, as opposed to like one of those externalities which aren't valued by the economic system. There's so much once you get started on this, if we could go to the pub, we'd be in the pub all night, right, talking about it. But it's reminded me of a conversation I had with a Conservative MP, quite an ambitious Conservative MP, and I was proposing what the science required in terms of changes, reduction in carbon. And he said to me that if we did that, it would be akin to unilateral economic disarmament, was how he saw it. And it just stopped me in my tracks, that he was so clear that the economy was so much more important than the environment. And I've thought about it for a long time. And I've actually come to the consideration now that maybe he's right. It is unilateral economic disarmament. But actually, the time of fighting for economic advantage has actually now passed. And that is exactly what we need to do. And we need to now live within the planetary boundaries, and that this will require cooperation at a local, national and international level. And that's what COVID-19 is showing us, is that to respond to global crisis, we actually need to act internationally and take account those very long supply lines that we've actually developed and that we live within. And so I almost want to go back to him now and say, yes, you're right. You are right. That is what is required, and this is how we need to do it. And so just thinking about have you got any final thoughts just before we wrap up on those links of where we need to go next? Days.
Yeah, I think it's made me think a lot more about the economy. I feel like that's in a way that I kind of hope the experts know what they're doing and leave them to it. I probably shouldn't. And I probably should like urge more young people to start knowing about it and start looking at how we can create an economy that's actually better for the future and more sustainable, and if not even better, regenerative. So I think that's kind of like what I'm taking from this conversation. And there is so much learning to do about degrowth models, about other economic models, including the Doughnut theory. There is so much to learn, and I'm very excited.
Jordan, final words.
Yeah, I mean, for one, I'd direct that MP to the UN special report on 1.5 degrees, which says that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is going to result in savings of somewhere between 10 and 40 trillion dollars compared to 2 degrees. What we're not talking about going back to the dark ages. We're talking about recognizing that our well-being is not just dependent on the cogs and gears that grind up all this natural matter into stuff. It's dependent on the health of the natural world itself. And the question we need to ask ourselves is how we balance those two sources of happiness out there. And I for one don't think this is going to be the last crisis that we'll face in the coming decade. And I don't think that the conversations that are happening now are by any means the end of the story, the end of this economic story. And that is scary, but it's also empowering, because it means that the cracks in the system that we've been crying out for to change are getting larger. And it's our job to be ready to reorganize that system when it fails. And so, please attend the rest of the talks this week, because it is so important for us to take this knowledge into our own hands and be able to challenge power when they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes. Thank
you, Jordan. There's a brilliant summing up from Violet Mays, who said, "I hate living in an economy." Well done, Violet. That's brilliant. You've just encapsulated the last 45 minutes. We should have had you on the panel. We're going to take a 30-minute break before heading for financial extinction. I'd like to thank all the tech. I'd like to thank all of you for coming in, and thanks for the questions. Sorry I didn't get around to too many of them. They were great. I did struggle on my iPhone, so thanks for bearing with me if I didn't ask your question. Thank you, Days. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Tech. Thank you.